A GoodKnight Story. In 1094 AD, a silver-armored knight stood in the dust of the Spanish frontier as King Sancho Ramírez fell to an archer's arrow beneath the walls of Huesca, transforming a methodical siege into a desperate fight for survival. And our good knight, trapped in the rearguard of a collapsing army, had to hold the line long enough for a kingdom to escape with its dead king and its future. This wasn't just another battle in the centuries-long Reconquista. This was the moment when the death of a monarch nearly shattered the kingdom of Aragon, when the fortress city of Huesca, the city of 99 towers, proved that stone walls and disciplined archers could kill kings, and when a fighting retreat through the June heat became as significant a military achievement as any conquest. Watch as our good knight, an infanzon of the lower nobility, experiences the brutal reality of medieval siege warfare. The construction of the massive stone fortress of Monte Aragon, the suffocating heat of Spanish summer in full mail armor, the chaos of a sortie by Andalusi light cavalry, and the grinding terror of protecting a royal corpse during a withdrawal under fire. From the fertile plains of the Hoya de Huesca to the sacred cliffs of San Juan de la Peña, from the clash of Christian heavy cavalry against Muslim jinetes to the moment a new king swore vengeance over his father's tomb, this is the story of the Aragonese setback of 1094, a defeat that planted the seeds of future victory. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive journeys through history's turning points, where our eternal knight in silver armor walks beside you through the rise and fall of kingdoms, with storytelling crafted for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which forgotten siege or desperate retreat you'd like the good knight to survive next. But for now, settle in, breathe deep, and travel back to that scorching June day when a kingdom learned that sometimes survival is victory enough. Chapter 1. The weight of the Hoya. The good knight had learned long ago that war was not the clash of swords in a single afternoon, but the slow accumulation of discomforts that ground a man down until he was too tired to be afraid anymore. It was June in the year of our Lord 1094, and he sat astride his destrier on a low rise east of the city of Huesca, the place the Christians called Huesca, watching the sun climb over the distant peaks of the Pyrenees. The light was already harsh, the kind that made the eyes ache, even in the early morning. By midday it would be brutal. He shifted in his saddle. The mail hauberk, his loriga, hung heavy on his shoulders, the iron rings pressing through the padded gambeson beneath. 12 kilograms of metal distributed across his torso and thighs, split at the groin and backside so he could ride. In the cool of dawn it was merely uncomfortable. In 3 hours, when the sun reached its zenith, it would become an oven that cooked him slowly from the paustantian, outside in. But he did not remove it. No man in the rearguard removed his armor. Not here, not this close to the walls. The good knight was 30 years old, though he felt older. He had been born in a stone house in the high valleys near Jaca, the son of a minor lord whose lands consisted of a single village, a mill, and a stretch of rocky pasture that could support perhaps 200 sheep. He was an infanzon, a knight of the lower nobility, a man who owned a horse and a sword, but little else. His wealth was his skill. His future was war. He had followed King Sancho Ramírez for a decade now, riding south each spring when the snows melted and the mountain passes opened. South to the frontier, south to the land of the Moors, south to the places where a man could win land or die trying. This year, the king had promised them Huesca. The good knight turned his gaze toward the city. It sat on the plain below him, perhaps 2 kilometers distant, a sprawl of white and ochre buildings, enclosed by a circuit of walls that seemed to go on forever. The walls were not the crude timber palisades of the northern fortresses. These were ashlar stone and tapial, rammed earth that had hardened over centuries into something nearly as strong as rock. And rising from those walls, like the teeth of some great beast, were the towers. 99 of them, they said, or perhaps 100. The good knight had never counted. He knew only that wherever he looked along that perimeter, there was a tower, and in each tower there were archers. The city had earned its reputation. Huesca was the northern sentinel of the Taifa of Zaragoza, the shield that protected the rich Ebro Valley from the Christian kingdoms of the mountains. For 2 centuries it had stood unconquered. Kings had died trying to take it. And now, the good knight thought, another king was trying. He could see the royal standard flying from the castle of Monte Aragon, the massive stone fortress that King Sancho had built, on the plateau to the east of the city. It had taken months to construct, stone hauled up from the river valleys, masons brought from across the Pyrenees, laborers working in shifts through the spring rains. The castle was not a temporary siege work. It was a statement. It said, "We are not leaving." The good knight had helped guard the construction crews. He had ridden patrol along the roads, watching for sorties from the city, watching for the relief army that everyone knew was gathering in Zaragoza. He had spent weeks in the saddle, sleeping in his armor, eating hard bread and salted pork, watering his horse at the river Flumen while keeping one eye on the horizon. It was the kind of war that did not make songs. It was the war of waiting. But waiting, the good knight had learned, could kill you just as dead as a sword. The sun continued its climb. The heat began to press down on the plain like a physical weight. The good knight could feel the sweat starting to soak into the gambeson, the wool padding that sat between his skin and the iron rings. Soon it would be drenched. By evening, when he finally removed the armor, the gambeson would be stiff with salt and stink. He glanced to his left. His mesnada, his squadron, sat their horses in a loose line along the ridge. 12 men, all infant zones like himself, all veterans of the frontier. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They had been here for weeks. They knew the routine. Below them, scattered across the plain between the ridge and the city walls, were the forward positions of the Aragonese army. Wooden palisades, ditches, earthworks. Small camps where the infantry sheltered from the sun and waited for orders that rarely came. The siege had settled into a stalemate. The Aragonese could not breach the walls. The defenders could not break the blockade. So both sides waited, and men died slowly from disease and skirmishes rather than quickly in battle. The good knight preferred the quick deaths. At least those made sense. A shout rose from one of the forward camps. The good knight's hand went instinctively to the hilt of his sword, but he did not draw. He watched, waited. A group of riders emerged from the camp, moving at a trot toward the city. Not a charge, a patrol, or perhaps a reconnaissance. The good knight counted 6 men, all mounted, all armored. They moved carefully, staying out of bow range, circling toward the western side of the city where the ground was more broken. The walls of Huesca watched them in silence. Then, from one of the towers near the western gate, a banner unfurled. The good knight could not make out the design from this distance, but he saw the movement, saw the flash of color against the pale stone. A signal. The gates opened. The good knight felt his stomach tighten. He had seen this before. The garrison of Huesca did not cower behind their walls. They were professionals, well-paid soldiers of the Taifa, and they knew how to fight. The riders that poured from the gate were light cavalry. Jinetes, the Moors called them. They rode small, fast horses, sitting high in the saddle with short stirrups, and they carried javelins and composite bows. They did not wear the heavy mail of the Christian knights. They did not need to. Their weapon was speed. The Aragonese patrol saw them coming and turned to flee, but it was already too late. The jinetes spread out in a crescent, cutting off the angles of escape, and began to loose arrows and javelins as they closed the distance. The good knight watched one of the Aragonese riders go down, his horse stumbling as a javelin caught it in the flank. The rider hit the ground hard, tried to rise, and was ridden down by 2 jinetes who circled him like wolves. The other 5 Aragonese made it back to the safety of the forward camp. But the Tuas, damage was done, 1 man lost, 1 horse lost, and the garrison of Huesca had reminded the besiegers that the city was not helpless. The jinetes did not press the attack. They wheeled their horses and rode back toward the gate, their laughter carrying faintly across the plain. The gates closed behind them. The good knight exhaled slowly. His hand was still on his sword hilt. He forced himself to relax, to let go. This was the rhythm of the siege. Probe, skirmish, retreat. Day after day, week after week. He wondered how long the king intended to stay. The answer came sooner than he expected. It was mid-morning when the horn sounded from Monte Aragon. 3 long blasts, the signal for the commanders to assemble. The good knight was not a commander, but his lord was, and so he followed as the ricos hombres and their retinues rode toward the castle. Monte Aragon sat on a high plateau, its walls rising sheer from the rock. It was an impressive fortification, built in the Frankish style, with square towers and a central keep. The royal standard flew from the highest tower, and beneath it the good knight could see the banners of the great lords of Aragon, the houses of Biel, of Loire, of Ayerbe, the men who held the honore, the great land grants, and commanded the armies of the kingdom. The good knight dismounted in the outer bailey and waited with the other infanzones while the lords entered the keep for the council. He found a patch of shade against the wall and sat, removing his helmet and running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. His head ached. The heat was relentless. Around him, the other knights were doing the same, stripping off gloves, loosening straps, trying to find some relief from the armor. No one spoke much. They were too tired. The council lasted an hour. When the lords emerged, their faces were grim. The good knight's lord, a baron named Fortun, who held lands near Ayerbe, walked directly to his men and gestured for them to gather close. "The king is going to inspect the forward lines," Fortun said quietly. "He wants to see the western wall up close. He thinks there may be a weak point near the gate of Monte Aragon." The good knight felt a chill despite the heat. "He's going to the wall? In person?" Fortun nodded. "He wants to see it himself. He doesn't trust the reports." One of the other infanzones, a man named Garcia, spat into the dust. "The reports are fine. The wall is solid. There's no weak point. The king is going to get himself killed." Fortun's face darkened. "Watch your tongue, Garcia. The king knows what he's doing." Garcia said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. The good knight looked toward the city. From here, he could see the western wall clearly, the towers rising at regular intervals, the crenellations sharp against the sky. He could see the gate of Monte Aragon, the Porteta, as some called it, a narrow opening flanked by 2 massive towers. He could also see the archers on the walls. "When?" the good knight asked. "This afternoon," Fortun said. "We ride escort." Chapter 2. The Arrow. They rode out from Monte Aragon in the early afternoon, when the heat was at its worst. The king's party was small, perhaps 20 men, all mounted, all armored. King Sancho Ramírez rode at the center, his helmet off, his face flushed from the heat. He was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with a beard that had gone mostly grey. He had ruled Aragon for 30 years, and in that time he had transformed it from a minor mountain county into a kingdom that could challenge the Taifas on equal terms. He was also, the good knight thought, too brave for his own good. The party moved slowly across the plain, following the line of the siege works toward the western side of the city. The good knight rode in the outer ring of the escort, his eyes scanning the walls, watching for movement. The towers were silent. The crenellations were empty. It felt wrong. They reached the forward camp, a cluster of wooden palisades and tents where a company of infantry was stationed. The king dismounted and walked to the edge of the ditch that had been dug to protect the camp from sorties. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the wall, his hands on his hips. The good knight dismounted as well, staying close to his horse, his hand on the reins. The other knights formed a loose perimeter, their shields ready, their eyes on the city. The king pointed toward the wall. "There," he said to one of the lords beside him. "Do you see? The masonry is different near the base of that tower. It's been repaired. That means it was damaged at some point. If it was damaged once, it can be damaged again." The lord, an older man named Sancho Garces, nodded slowly. "Perhaps, my lord, but we would need siege engines, mangonels at least, and we would need to get them close enough to the wall to be effective." "Then we build them," the king said. "We have the timber. We have the engineers. It can be done." The good knight was only half listening. His attention was on the wall, on the tower the king had pointed to, on the narrow slit windows that ran up its height. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement. A shadow behind one of the slits. "My lord," he started to say. The arrow came before he could finish. It was a long shot, perhaps 150 meters, but the archer was skilled, or lucky, or both. The arrow arced high, catching the sunlight for a moment, and then dropped with terrible precision. It struck King Sancho Ramírez in the chest, just below the collarbone, in the gap between the mail hauberk and the aventail that protected his neck. The king staggered. His hand went to the arrow shaft, his face registering shock more than pain. He tried to speak, but no words came. His knees buckled. The good knight was moving before the king hit the ground. He threw himself forward, catching the king's weight, lowering him as gently as he could into the dust. Around him, the other knights were shouting, forming a shield wall, their bodies between the king and the city. But no more arrows came. The good knight looked down at the king. The arrow had gone deep, the shaft protruding from the chest at an angle. Blood was spreading across the white linen tunic beneath the mail, a dark stain that grew with each heartbeat. The king's eyes were open. He was trying to breathe, but the breaths were shallow, wet. The good knight had seen enough wounds to know what that meant. The arrow had pierced the lung. "Get him to the castle!" Someone was shouting. "Get him to Monte Aragon, now!" Hands grabbed the king, lifting him. The good knight stepped back, his own hands slick with blood. He watched as they carried the king to a horse, draping him across the saddle like a sack of grain because he could no longer sit upright. The party began to move, fast now, no longer cautious. The good knight mounted his own horse and rode with them, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The king had been shot. The king was dying. And the good knight knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone, that everything was about to change. They reached Monte Aragon in minutes, though it felt like hours. The king was carried into the keep, into the private chambers that had been prepared for him. Priests were summoned, physicians. The lords of the kingdom gathered in the hall below, their voices low, their faces pale. The good knight stood in the courtyard, still holding his horse's reins, still covered in the king's blood. He did not know what to do. He did not know what was expected of him. So he waited. The sun moved across the sky. The heat did not relent. Men came and went from the keep, their expressions growing darker with each passing hour. And then, as the sun touched the western horizon, the bell began to toll. Slow, steady. The death knell. King Sancho Ramírez, king of Aragon and Navarre, vassal of the Holy See, conqueror of Graus and Monzon, builder of Monte Aragon, was dead. The good knight closed his eyes. The siege was over. Chapter 3. The Heir. The night that followed the king's death was the longest the good knight had ever known. He did not sleep. None of the men in the camp slept. They sat by their fires, speaking in low voices, or they sat in silence, staring into the flames. The question that hung over them all was unspoken, but understood. What happens now? In the feudal order of the kingdom, the bonds of loyalty were personal. A knight swore his oath to a lord, and that lord swore his oath to the king. But when the king died, those oaths, technically, dissolved. They would need to be renewed with the heir. The heir was Peter, Pedro in the language of the kingdom. He was Sancho's son, a man in his 20s, and he had been present at the siege. The good knight had seen him once or twice, riding with his father's retinue, but he did not know him. Few of the Infanzones did. Peter had spent much of his youth in the monasteries, being educated by the monks. He was said to be pious, learned, but no one knew if he could lead. And leadership, the good knight thought, was what they needed now, because the army was beginning to fracture. By dawn, the rumors had started. Some of the lords were saying they would return to their lands to bury the king properly at San Juan de la Peña, the royal monastery carved into the cliffs north of Jaca. Others were saying they would stay and continue the siege in the king's name. Still others were saying nothing at all, which was perhaps the most dangerous sign. The good knight's lord, Fortune, gathered his men in the early morning and spoke plainly. "The king is dead," Fortune said. "His body will be taken to San Juan de la Peña for burial. Prince Peter will accompany the body and will be crowned there. The siege is lifted. We are going home." One of the Infanzones, Garcia, the same man who had questioned the king's decision to approach the walls, spoke up. "What about Huesca? We've been here for months. We've built Monte Aragon. Are we just going to abandon it?" Fortune shook his head. "Monte Aragon will be garrisoned. A small force will remain to hold it, but the main army is withdrawing. Those are the orders." "Whose orders?" Garcia demanded. "Peter's? He's not even king yet." Fortune's face hardened. "He is the heir. His word is law until he is crowned, and then it will still be law. If you have a problem with that, Garcia, you are welcome to leave my service." Garcia said nothing, but his jaw was tight, and the good knight could see the anger in his eyes. The good knight understood the anger. They had all sacrificed for this siege, months of their lives, the heat, the disease, the constant threat of ambush. And now they were being told to leave, to abandon the prize they had been promised. But the good knight also understood the necessity. An army without a king was not an army, it was a mob. And a mob could not hold a siege against a city like Huesca. So they would leave. And they would hope that the city did not realize how vulnerable they were during the withdrawal. The order of march was established by mid-morning. The baggage train would go first, the wagons carrying supplies, the wounded, and the king's body, which had been wrapped in linen soaked with salt and herbs to slow the decay. The main body of the army would follow, the infantry, the lords, and the bulk of the cavalry, and the rearguard would come last. The rearguard was always the most dangerous position in a retreat. It was the unit that stayed between the retreating army and the enemy, the unit that absorbed the pursuit, the unit that died so the rest could escape. The good knight was assigned to the rearguard. He was not surprised. The rearguard was always composed of the best cavalry, the men who could fight mounted and dismounted, the men who could hold a line under pressure. The Infanzones were the natural choice. Fortune gathered the rearguard, perhaps 200 knights in total, drawn from several lords' retinues, and gave them their orders. "We move slowly," Fortune said. "We stay in formation. If the Moors sortie, we do not pursue. We hold them, we drive them back, and we continue the march. Our job is to protect the column, not to win glory. Understood?" The knights nodded. The good knight checked his equipment one last time. His hauberk was secure. His shield was strapped to his saddle. His sword was loose in its scabbard. His horse was rested and watered. He was as ready as he would ever be. The column began to move at noon. The baggage train rolled north, toward the river Flumen, toward the roads that would take them into the foothills and eventually to San Juan de la Peña. The main body followed, a long line of men and horses stretching across the plain, and the rearguard formed up at the rear, facing south, facing the city. The good knight sat his horse and watched the walls of Huesca. The towers were silent. The gates were closed. But he knew they were watching. Chapter 4. The Sortie. The column had been moving for perhaps an hour when the gates of Huesca opened. The good knight saw it happen. One moment the western gate was closed, a solid barrier of wood and iron. The next moment it was swinging open, and riders were pouring through. Jinetes, dozens of them, perhaps 100. They did not form up in neat ranks. They spread out across the plain in a loose swarm, moving fast, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. They were not charging the rearguard directly. They were circling, probing, looking for weakness. The good knight felt his pulse quicken. His hand tightened on the reins. His horse sensed his tension and shifted beneath him, eager to move. "Hold!" Fortune's voice rang out. "Hold the line!" The rearguard did not move. 200 knights in a double line, shields raised, lances ready. They watched the jinetes circle, watched them draw closer, watched them begin to loose arrows. The arrows came in a hissing cloud. Most fell short, striking the ground in front of the line. A few reached the knights, clattering off shields and armor. One horse screamed and reared as an arrow struck its flank, but the rider controlled it, kept it in line. The jinetes circled closer. They were shouting now, taunting, trying to provoke a charge. The good knight could see their faces, young men, most of them, bearded, their eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. "Hold," Fortune said again. The jinetes made another pass, loosing more arrows, and then they wheeled away, riding back toward the city. For a moment, the good knight thought they were done, that the sortie had been a gesture, a way to harass the retreat, but nothing more. Then the gates opened again, and the heavy cavalry came out. These were not jinetes. These were knights, Christian knights, wearing mail and surcoats, carrying lances and swords. The good knight recognized the banners. Castilian, the allies of the Taifa, the mercenaries who fought for Zaragoza's gold. And leading them was a man whose banner the good knight knew well, Garcia Ordóñez, the Count of Nájera, one of the most powerful lords in Castile. The good knight felt his stomach turn. This was not a skirmish. This was a battle. The Castilian knights formed up in a wedge, perhaps 50 strong, and began to advance at a trot. They were not rushing. They were professionals, and they knew their business. Fortune raised his lance. "Prepare to receive." The rearguard tightened its formation. The front line lowered their lances, bracing the butts against their stirrups. The second line raised their shields, ready to support. The good knight was in the second line. He could see the Castilians coming, could see the sunlight glinting off their helmets, could hear the thunder of their hooves. 50 meters, 30, 20. "San Jorge!" Fortune roared. "Aragon!" The lines collided. The impact was like a thunderclap. Lances shattered, horses screamed, men shouted and cursed and died. The good knight's horse surged forward as the line compressed. He raised his shield, felt a lance glance off it, felt the shock run up his arm. He dropped the shield slightly and thrust with his own lance, aiming for the gap between a Castilian knight's helmet and shoulder. The lance struck mail, skidded off, And then the press of bodies was too tight for lances, and he let his go, drawing his sword. The melee was chaos. There was no room to maneuver, no room to think. The good knight hacked at anything that moved, his sword rising and falling, the blade ringing against helmets and shields. His horse bit and kicked, as much a weapon as the sword. A Castilian knight swung a mace at his head. The good knight raised his shield, felt the impact, felt the wood crack. He thrust his sword at the knight's face, and the man jerked back. And then someone else was between them. And the moment was gone. The fight lasted minutes, though it felt like hours. And then, suddenly, the pressure eased. The Castilians were pulling back, disengaging, riding back toward the city. The good knight lowered his sword, gasping for breath. His shield was ruined, the wood split down the middle. His sword was notched and bloody. His horse was bleeding from a cut on its shoulder, but it was still standing. Around him, the rearguard was reforming. Men were checking their weapons, checking their horses, checking each other. The good knight counted the bodies on the ground. 5 Aragonese knights down, perhaps a dozen Castilians. Not a victory, but not a defeat either. Fortune rode along the line, his face grim. "We keep moving," he said. "They'll be back." The column resumed its march. Chapter 5. They reached the river Flumen in the late afternoon. The river was not wide, perhaps 20 meters across, but it was deep enough that the wagons would need to ford carefully. There was a crossing point, a place where the riverbed was gravel rather than mud, and the column began to funnel toward it. The good knight, still in the rearguard, watched the main body cross. The wagons went first, their wheels creaking, the drivers shouting at the oxen. Then the infantry, wading through the water that came up to their thighs. Then the lords and their retinues. The rearguard waited on the south bank, watching the plain behind them. The jinetes had returned. They were keeping their distance now, staying out of lance range. But they were there, watching, waiting. The good knight knew what they were waiting for. They were waiting for the rearguard to cross, because that was when the column would be most vulnerable, when half the rearguard was in the water and half was still on the bank, when the formation was broken and the knights were dismounted and leading their horses through the current. That was when the jinetes would strike. Fortune knew it too. He divided the rearguard into 3 groups. The first group would cross and form up on the north bank. The second group would wait on the south bank, holding the crossing. The third group, the good knight's group, would dismount and hold the riverbank itself, forming a shield wall to protect the crossing point. The good knight dismounted and handed his reins to one of the squires. He drew his sword and took his place in the line, his ruined shield on his left arm, his shoulder pressed against the man next to him. The first group began to cross. The horses entered the water carefully, their riders guiding them, the current pulling at their legs. The jinetes saw the movement and began to advance. They came fast, a wave of horsemen sweeping across the plain, their javelins raised, their voices rising in an ululating cry. "Brace!" Fortune shouted. The shield wall tightened. The good knight set his feet, his shield raised, his sword ready. The jinetes did not charge into the shield wall. They were not fools. Instead, they rode along the line, hurling javelins, loosing arrows, trying to break the formation. A javelin struck the good knight's shield, the point punching through the wood and stopping inches from his face. He twisted the shield, snapping the shaft, and kept his position. Another javelin struck the man next to him, catching him in the thigh below the edge of his hauberk. The man grunted and staggered, but he did not fall. The good knight stepped closer, supporting him, keeping the line intact. The jinetes made another pass, and another, but the shield wall held. And then, from the north bank, the first group of the rearguard, now across the river and remounted, charged. The jinetes saw them coming and scattered, their horses wheeling away, their riders shouting warnings. The charge did not catch them, but it drove them back, bought time. "Go!" Fortune shouted. "Second group, cross now!" The good knight's group, the third group, held the line as the second group splashed into the river. The water was cold, the current strong. The horses struggled, but they made it across. And then it was the good knight's turn. "Fall back!" Fortune ordered. "Into the water! Keep your shields up!" The shield wall began to move, stepping backward, the men keeping their formation even as they entered the river. The water rose to the good knight's knees, then his waist. The current pulled at him, trying to knock him off balance. His mail hauberk, soaked with water, became impossibly heavy. The genates saw the opportunity and charged again, riding to the water's edge, hurling their javelins into the retreating line. A javelin struck the man in front of the good knight, catching him in the neck above his mail. The man fell forward into the water, his blood spreading in a dark cloud. The good knight kept moving. 1 step. Another. The north bank was close now. 10 meters. 5. His foot found solid ground. He climbed out of the river, water streaming from his armor, and turned to face the south bank. The genators were not following. They sat their horses on the far side of the river, watching. Their javelins spent. The rearguard had made it across. The good knight collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his sword still in his hand. They had survived. Chapter 6. The long road, the march to San Juan de la Peña, took 3 days. 3 days of heat and dust and exhaustion. 3 days of watching the horizon for pursuit that never came. 3 days of carrying the body of a dead king through the land he had tried to conquer. The good knight rode in silence. His horse was limping slightly from the cut on its shoulder, but it kept moving. His armor was still damp from the river crossing, the mail beginning to rust in places. His shield was gone, left behind on the south bank of the Flumen. His sword was notched and dull, but he was alive. On the second day, they entered the foothills. The plain gave way to rocky slopes and pine forests. The air grew cooler. The good knight felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. They were in Aragon now. They were home. On the third day, they reached San Juan de la Peña. The monastery was unlike any other place in the kingdom. It was not built on a hill or in a valley. It was built into a cliff. The buildings nestled beneath a massive overhang of rock that sheltered them from the sky. The church itself was carved into the living stone, its columns and arches emerging from the mountain as if they had always been there. The good knight had been here once before, years ago, and the sight of it still took his breath away. The column halted in the clearing before the monastery. The monks emerged, their robes black against the pale stone, their faces solemn. They had been expecting the king's body. Word had been sent ahead. The litter bearing King Sancho Ramírez was carried into the church. The lords followed, and then the knights, filing into the dim interior, where the air was cool and smelled of incense and old stone. The good knight stood at the back of the church, his helmet under his arm, and watched as the king was laid to rest in the royal pantheon. The tomb was simple, a stone sarcophagus carved with a cross and the king's name. No grand effigy, no gilded ornament, just stone. The priests chanted the prayers for the dead. The lords bowed their heads. And Prince Peter, soon to be King Peter, stood at his father's side, his face unreadable. When the prayers were finished, Peter stepped forward. He placed his hand on the tomb and spoke, his voice low but clear. "I swear before God and before these witnesses that I will not rest until Huesca is taken. My father died for that city. I will finish what he began." The church was silent. And then, one by one, the lords stepped forward and knelt before Peter, renewing their oaths of fealty. The good knight watched as his own lord, Fortune, knelt and spoke the words. And then Fortune rose and gestured for his men to come forward. The good knight walked to the front of the church. He knelt before Peter, his knee on the cold stone, and spoke the oath. "I swear to serve you, my lord, with my sword and my life, until death or release." Peter looked down at him. The new king's eyes were hard, but there was something else there too. Determination. Purpose. "Rise," Peter said, "and know that we will return to Huesca, not this year, but soon, and when we do, we will not fail." The good knight rose. He believed him. 2 years passed. The good knight spent those years in the high valleys, tending to his small estate, repairing his equipment, training his horse. He did not forget Huesca. He thought of it often. The walls, the towers, the heat of the plain, the weight of the retreat. And he waited. In the spring of 1096, the summons came. King Peter was calling the host. The siege of Huesca was to resume. The good knight rode south once more, joining the column of knights and infantry that descended from the mountains into the Hoya. The army was larger this time. Peter had spent 2 years preparing, gathering allies, securing supplies, and Monte Aragon was still there, still garrisoned, still a thorn in the side of the city. The siege began again in earnest. This time, the Aragonese had siege engines, mangonels that hurled stones at the walls, battering rams that were wheeled up to the gates under the cover of wooden shields. The fighting was brutal. The defenders of Huesca fought with the guisards, desperation of men who knew that this time the Christians would not leave. The good knight fought in the assaults. He climbed ladders under a hail of arrows. He stood in the shield wall as the rams pounded the gates. He saw men die beside him, saw the walls crack and crumble, saw the towers fall. And on November 27th, 1096, the walls of Huesca were breached. The Aragonese poured into the city. The fighting in the streets was savage, house to house, room to room, but by nightfall the city was theirs. The good knight stood in the main square of Huesca, his armor battered, his sword bloody, and looked up at the towers that had defied them for so long. The city had fallen. King Peter had kept his oath, and the good knight had survived to see it. The good knight was granted land in the Hoya as part of the repartimiento, the distribution of the conquered territory. A small estate, a village, fields that would grow wheat and barley. It was more than he had ever owned before. But as he stood on his new land and looked south toward the city, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion. He had spent his life at war. He had followed kings and lords, had fought in sieges and skirmishes, had seen cities fall and men die. And for what? For a piece of land, for a place to grow old. He thought of King Sancho, lying in his tomb at San Juan de la Peña. He thought of the men who had died at the river crossing, at the walls, in the streets of Huesca. He thought of the arrow that had killed a king. And he wondered if any of it had been worth it. But the land was his now. The war was over. And the good knight, for the first time in his life, could rest. He removed his armor, piece by piece, and set it aside. The mail hauberk, the helmet, the sword. He would keep them, of course. A man on the frontier always kept his weapons. But for now, he was done. The good knight walked into his new house, closed the door, and let the weight of 30 years of war finally fall from his shoulders.